Raffaele Conti had everything people pray for every night. A grand mansion in the heart of Chicago, tall iron gates, polished cars that made passersby turn their heads. Everywhere he went, people bowed and called him boss with deep respect. But Rafe knew the truth. Most of those bows were not for him. They were for his power and his money. That night he sat alone in his vast study. The room was silent, but his mind was not. His phone buzzed. A woman, her voice sweet as honey, mentioned a handbag she had happened to like in a shop that afternoon. Before he could put the phone down, another message came in, asking for money too. He walked to the window. Outside, the lights fell on his cars, beautiful and cold. He remembered the woman who had sworn she loved him after only 2 meetings, and by the 3rd asked to borrow a large sum. He remembered another who wept in his arms, until he discovered every tear had been carefully measured. All his life, Rafe had given orders, and all his life, no one had dared lie to his face. But there was one question no power could answer, a question that stayed in his heart and would not let him sleep. If I had nothing left in my hands, would there be a single woman in this world who still loved me for real? That night, a reckless plan began to take shape in the mind of the most powerful man in the city. He had no idea that the decision to come would pull him away from everything he had ever owned and lead him to a secret buried for years, a secret powerful enough to change everything. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button to encourage us to keep going. Don't forget to share this video with the people you love, so we can spread the beautiful values that make life more meaningful. And please subscribe to the channel today, so you won't miss the heartfelt stories still to come. That morning, before the city had even begun to awaken, a man quietly stepped out of a small apartment buried deep within a poor working-class neighborhood. No one noticed him. No one knew that only a few hours earlier, he had still been the most powerful man inside a magnificent mansion. The night before, after the entire city had fallen asleep, Rafe had called Luigi, the only loyal right-hand man he could truly trust. In a low, unwavering voice, he had given his instructions one word at a time, telling Luigi that from that day forward, all family business would temporarily be placed in his hands, that no one was to know where Rafe was, and that no one was allowed to search for him, no matter what might happen. Luigi had remained stunned for a long time before finally speaking. He couldn't understand why a man standing at the very height of power would willingly walk away from everything, even if only for a while. But he had served beside Rafe long enough to know that once this man had made a decision, no warning, argument, or plea could change his mind. Luigi had merely nodded and said he would protect the secret with his life. Rafe knew he could trust him. That night, he took nothing with him except an old cloth bag containing a few sets of faded clothes, the kind of things he had never once touched in his entire life. He rented a miserable apartment in the poorest part of the city, where damp stains spread across the walls and the restless noise of a hard, crowded life drifted through an aging window. He paid for a used delivery van whose paint peeled away in patches and whose engine coughed and sputtered every time it started. Then he applied for work as a delivery driver with a small local company, using a completely unfamiliar name, Rafe Marino, a name with no connection to power or wealth, the name of an invisible man among millions of people struggling simply to survive. When all the paperwork was complete, he returned to the small apartment and stood before a cloudy mirror hanging crookedly on the wall. The man in the reflection wore a worn delivery uniform, its shoulders faded with age, and a pair of shoes with heels worn thin. Rafe studied that image for a long time, and for one brief moment, he didn't recognize himself. The face was still the same, yet the powerful man who had once made an entire city tremble with caution had disappeared. In his place stood only a poor delivery driver, a man so ordinary that no one would bother to look at him twice. He smiled faintly, a smile touched by both bitterness and relief. All his life, he had lived surrounded by luxury. People had bowed before him and showered him with praise, but not once had he known what it felt like to stand in the middle of the world with nothing in his hands. Now, he was about to find out. He reminded himself that this wasn't a joke, nor was it a fleeting moment of recklessness. This was the answer he had searched for through countless sleepless nights. If everything belonging to Rafe Conti vanished, if there were no mansion, no expensive cars, and no name that made people wary, would there still be anyone in this world who would look at him with sincerity and treat him with genuine kindness? He slung the bag over his shoulder, tightened his hands around the steering wheel of the old van, and drew in a deep breath. Outside, the poor working-class neighborhood was slowly coming to life with the calls of street vendors, the blaring of horns, and the hurried footsteps of people beginning another day of earning their living. Rafe disappeared into that moving crowd, carrying a new identity and an old question that still had no answer. He didn't yet know that this seemingly insane decision would take him farther than anything he could have imagined, toward people who would change his life, and toward a truth that had been buried for years, one that even he had never suspected. The double life of the man who had once possessed everything began at that very moment. The first delivery came when the sun had just risen high into the sky. The old phone in Rafe's pocket vibrated to announce a new order, and he stared at the screen for a long moment before he understood what he was supposed to do. He had never personally delivered anything in his life. All his life, he had simply given orders, and other people had carried them out. Now he was the one who had to weave through heavy traffic, drive to an unfamiliar address, knock on someone's door, and lower his head as he handed over the package. The morning streets were packed, vehicles stretched in endless lines, creeping forward inch by inch, while impatient horns blared from every direction. Rafe sat inside the old van as sweat began soaking through the back of his shirt, and the clock on the screen kept counting down each passing minute with merciless indifference. By the time he completed his first delivery, he was already late. The customer opened the door, looked him over from head to toe with an irritated expression, then demanded to know why the delivery had taken so long, and whether Rafe understood that people were in a hurry. Rafe opened his mouth, intending to explain that the roads had been completely jammed, but the customer had already snatched the package from his hands and slammed the door shut in his face. He stood motionless for several seconds before the closed door. No one in his entire life had ever dared to shut a door in his face like that. No one had ever dared to speak to him in such a tone, but he swallowed his anger, turned away, and walked down the stairs, reminding himself that this was only the beginning. The second delivery came, then the third, and nothing became any easier. One customer made him wait beneath the scorching sun for nearly half an hour before casually coming down to collect the package without offering a single word of thanks. Another inspected the item from every angle, found fault with one thing after another, then refused to pay the additional service fee Rafe was supposed to receive. By noon, when he opened the application to check how much he had earned, he was stunned to discover that after the company had deducted every possible expense, almost nothing remained in his hands. The money he had earned through an entire morning of exhausting work was probably less than the tip he had once left for a server at an expensive restaurant. Rafe lowered himself onto a roadside step, his uniform drenched in sweat and clinging to his back, his legs aching, his throat dry because he hadn't found time to drink even a single mouthful of water all morning. He watched the stream of people passing by. Not one of them looked at him. Not one. He suddenly understood something strange that a lifetime of comfort had never allowed him to see. When he had been Raffaele Conti, people watched every step he took, listened to every word he spoke, and fell silent the moment he entered a room. But now, dressed in this worn uniform, he seemed to have become invisible. People walked past him as though he didn't exist. They shouted in his face, as though he had no feelings. They assumed that a poor delivery driver wasn't worth their attention. And in that moment, bitterness rose inside him. The same bitterness that countless poor working people tasted every day, yet something he had never once truly understood. For one brief second, Rafe thought about stopping. All he had to do was stand up and make a single phone call, and in less than an hour, a luxury car would arrive to take him back to the mansion, where servants waited on him, warm water was ready, meals were prepared, and all the respect the world had always shown him would be restored. He only had to let go, and every hardship would end. The thought flashed through his mind, tempting him with how easy it would be, but then he remembered the question that had brought him here, the question that had haunted him through so many long, sleepless nights. If he gave up now, he would never know the answer. He would remain forever a wealthy but lonely man, surrounded by false smiles and carefully calculated tears. His pride wouldn't allow him to fail after only one morning, and his heart, a heart already exhausted from being deceived, longed to know the truth more than anything else. Rafe clenched both hands, hands that were already beginning to grow rough. Slowly, he stood, brushed the dust from his clothes, and drew in a deep breath. The phone vibrated again, announcing another order. He looked at it for a moment, then pressed his lips together. He couldn't stop yet, not today. He climbed back into the old van, started the engine, and once again drove into the rushing current of life, carrying exhaustion in his body and a newly kindled determination in his heart. And so Rafe's first day as a poor man continued, more grueling and bitter than anything he had ever imagined. Yet it also taught him a lesson that his enormous fortune had never been able to buy. Late that afternoon, Rafe stopped at the neighborhood pickup station, a small yard where delivery workers gathered while waiting for their next orders. He was still utterly exhausted after the long day, his uniform wrinkled and his face coated with a thin layer of road dust. He parked the old van in a corner, lowered himself onto a chipped plastic chair, and tried to recover a little strength before his next delivery. Around him, the other drivers talked and laughed, complaining about difficult customers, gridlocked streets, and the meager amount of money they earned after spending an entire day beneath the burning sun. No one paid any attention to the newcomer sitting silently in the corner. Rafe had already grown accustomed to being invisible. In only one day, he had learned that in this world, a poor delivery driver wasn't worth anyone's concern. But then a voice rose beside him, gentle and friendly. It belonged to a young woman with a slender figure, her face glistening with beads of sweat, yet her eyes were remarkably bright and warm. She asked whether he was new to the job because she had never seen him working in that neighborhood before. Rafe was slightly surprised, but he gave a small nod. She smiled, introduced herself as Natalie, then naturally sat down in the chair beside him, as though they had known each other for years. She didn't look at him with suspicion, didn't study his worn clothing, and didn't offer a single contemptuous remark like so many of the people he had encountered that day. She simply spoke to him as she would speak to another human being, with quiet simplicity and genuine kindness. Seeing that he looked tired and confused, Natalie began offering him a few pieces of advice. She told him that the main road through downtown was always hopelessly congested at that hour, and that if he wanted to make his deliveries faster, he should take the narrow alley behind the market. It was slightly longer, but it would spare him from being trapped for hours in a motionless line of traffic. She also warned him never to park in front of the large buildings on the street corner because enforcement there was extremely strict, and one careless mistake could cost him an entire morning's wages. Rafe listened closely to every word, and a strange feeling began rising inside him. All day long, people had shouted at him, slammed doors in his face, and treated him as though he didn't exist. Yet this complete stranger, a woman who owed him nothing, was willing to share the valuable knowledge she had earned through countless days of hardship. When she noticed that his lips were dry and cracked, she reached into her bag, took out a bottle of water, the last one she had brought with her, and handed it to him without a moment's hesitation. Rafe paused and tried to refuse, but she pressed the bottle into his hand and told him to drink, saying that anyone who worked this job would collapse from exhaustion if they allowed themselves to become dehydrated. He accepted the bottle, and suddenly his throat tightened with emotion. Such a small gesture, a bottle of water worth almost nothing, yet in that moment it felt more precious to him than every expensive gift people had ever presented to the head of the Conti family. He knew this gift hadn't been offered as part of some calculation, and that she expected nothing in return. It had come from nothing more than a kind heart. Then, while they were talking, another delivery worker passed by and made a mocking remark that this job was degrading, that it wasn't worth the effort, and that anyone who kept doing it would never rise above their miserable circumstances. Natalie looked up at him and calmly gave an answer that made Rafe suddenly go still. She said there was no such thing as degrading honest work, that a person might be poor in money but mustn't ever become poor in self-respect, and that she would rather sweat for every clean dollar she earned than hold out her hand to beg or bow her head and do something dishonest. Those words came from a small woman sitting in a shabby yard after a long and exhausting day, yet they rang with dignity and pride. Rafe fell silent. All his life, he had lived among people draped in every kind of glittering luxury while remaining hollow inside. People who would willingly sell their character for the smallest advantage. He had met far too many wealthy people who were pitifully small in spirit, but this was the first time he had ever met someone poor who possessed such nobility. He looked at Natalie, at the woman with calloused hands and clear, honest eyes, and something inside him quietly stirred, something that had been sleeping for years beneath the frozen layers of his suspicion. He didn't know who she was or what secrets her life might be hiding, but in that very moment, Rafe began to sense that this meeting wouldn't be nothing more than a brief encounter. And indeed, he had no idea that the woman who had just shared her bottle of water with him was the very person who would lead him toward the answer he had spent his entire life searching for. A few days later, after Rafe had gradually grown accustomed to the rhythm of his new life, another woman entered his world, but in a way entirely different from Natalie. Her name was Brittany, and she also worked as a delivery driver in the neighborhood. But unlike the weary laborers around her, she was always carefully groomed, her face meticulously made up, her appearance striking among the crowd. From the very first moment she saw Rafe at the pickup station, an unusual gleam appeared in Brittany's eyes. She approached him on her own, offered him a bright smile, and told him that he looked far too handsome and sophisticated to be doing delivery work, that his face didn't resemble that of a poor laborer at all. Rafe merely returned her greeting with a faint smile, while a familiar sense of caution immediately stirred inside him. All his life, he had heard far too many compliments like those, sweet words spoken not because of the man he was, but because of something people hoped to gain from him. What made this time so strange was that he was now only a poor delivery driver dressed in an old uniform, with nothing anyone should have wanted. So, instead of driving her away, he decided to let her come closer and quietly observe what this woman truly wanted. From that day forward, Brittany began appearing beside him more and more often. She called him constantly, sometimes asking meaningless questions, sometimes inventing one excuse after another simply to keep him talking. She asked him to drive her from one place to another, claiming that her vehicle was broken and that he was the only person she trusted enough to ask for help. Each time she saw him, she behaved with excessive familiarity, laughing and chattering brightly, lightly touching his hand, and gazing at him as though he were the most remarkable man she had ever met. For another lonely man, that kind of attention might have been enough to stir the heart, but not for Rafe. He had lived too long in a world of schemes and hidden motives to be deceived by a few smiles and honeyed words. He noticed that Brittany's eyes never truly rested on his face. Instead, they often drifted toward his phone, glanced at the thin wallet inside his pocket, and searched for clues about what this man might actually possess. He also noticed that whenever he mentioned being short of money, her smile would briefly stiffen, only to be quickly concealed behind another sweet remark. Rafe pretended not to notice anything. He continued treating her politely, and occasionally drove her somewhere when she asked. He wanted to see how far this woman would go. He wanted to witness with his own eyes the moment that mask finally slipped away. Deep inside, he knew he was conducting an experiment, a test whose result he had probably already guessed, yet he still wanted to confirm it for himself. There was a bitter irony in the contrast, and even Rafe could see it clearly. Two women had entered his life during these strange days, yet they couldn't have been more different. Natalie had never once asked what he carried in his pocket. She had willingly shared her final bottle of water with him without expecting anything in return, and her eyes held a sincerity that money could never buy. Brittany, on the other hand, was a beautiful woman who constantly surrounded him with sweet words, while beneath them lay the kind of calculation he knew all too well. The longer Rafe watched, the more clearly those two extremes revealed themselves before him, and he began to understand that the test he had chosen wasn't only about finding an answer to love. It was also teaching him how to distinguish what was genuine from what was false in this world. Over the following days, Brittany clung to him more tightly than ever. She began telling him about the hardships in her life, the expenses she could barely manage, and the endless troubles she claimed to be carrying. Rafe listened to everything with a calm expression, but in his heart, he could already sense what was about to happen. He knew those stories of poverty and suffering hadn't appeared without purpose. They were only the opening notes, the first stones being laid upon the road leading toward what Brittany truly wanted. And so he waited in silence, waiting for the moment when that beautiful mask would fall away on its own and expose the real face beneath it. He didn't yet know that this very experiment would give him the first painful lesson on his journey to find a sincere heart in a world filled with deception. And then, little by little, exactly as Rafe had expected, the thing he had anticipated began to happen. One evening, Brittany sent him a message in her usual sweet tone, saying that her phone was almost out of credit and that she urgently needed to contact someone, then asked whether he could add a little money to it for her. The amount wasn't large, only enough to make it difficult for anyone to refuse. Rafe stared at the message for a long moment, then quietly transferred the money to her. He wanted to see how far she would go. As soon as she received it, Brittany showered him with thanks and sweet words, telling him that he was the kindest and most generous man she had ever known. But only a few days later, a second request arrived. This time, she said she hadn't eaten anything all day and had no money left in her pocket, then asked whether he could help her buy a meal. Rafe transferred the money again. He said nothing, and simply continued to observe her, like a man quietly turning the pages of a book whose ending he already knew. Once Brittany realized she could ask for a little, she began reaching for much more. One request followed another, each larger and bolder than the last. She complained that her hair looked neglected and that she needed to have it done properly, then said that customers looked down on delivery workers who appeared untidy, and asked him to lend her some money for beauty treatments. Rafe continued giving her what she asked for, but everything had already become perfectly clear in his mind. He realized that this woman had never once asked how he was living, never once cared whether he was tired, whether he had enough food, or whether he was struggling himself. The only thing that mattered to her was how much more he could still give. The more he gave, the more she demanded. Human greed was like a bottomless barrel, growing emptier no matter how much was poured into it. Then the moment of reckoning finally came. One day, Brittany called him, and this time her voice sounded entirely different, both pleading and urgent. She said her landlord was demanding the rent and that she would be thrown out onto the street if she couldn't pay immediately. Then she lowered her voice and asked him for a large sum of money, more than everything she had requested before combined. She cleverly added that she trusted him and knew he would never abandon her during such a difficult time. Rafe listened in silence until she had finished. This was the moment he had been waiting for. In a calm voice, he slowly replied that he was only a poor delivery driver, that he worked himself to exhaustion all day and barely earned enough to eat, and that he truly didn't have such a large amount of money to give her. He didn't say it because he cared about the money, because to Raffaele Conti, the amount Brittany had requested was no more significant than a grain of sand. He said it only because he wanted to see her reaction, to watch the mask finally fall. And fall it did, faster than he had imagined. There was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Then Brittany's voice changed completely, stripped of every trace of sweetness. In a cold, flat tone, she said that if he was truly that poor, he shouldn't have pretended to be generous in the first place, and then she abruptly hung up. From that day onward, Brittany disappeared from his life. There were no more cheerful calls, no more honeyed compliments, and no more eager looks whenever they met. On the few occasions when they crossed paths at the pickup station, she walked past him as though they had never known each other, her expression so indifferent and cold that Rafe nearly laughed. The woman who had once told him he was too handsome to be a delivery driver, the woman who had sworn that he was the only person she trusted, now treated him like a complete stranger simply because he no longer had any value she could exploit. Rafe stood in silence and watched her figure disappear into the distance, while a familiar bitterness rose within him. He had known how it would end, yet when it truly happened, he still felt a faint ache in his heart. It confirmed once again the thing he had always feared, that in this world, the affection people offered one another was often measured only by what they stood to gain. But then he gently shook his head and reminded himself that this was only half of the answer. Brittany had given him his first painful lesson in greed and deception. Yet somewhere out there was still a young woman who had shared her final bottle of water with him without asking for anything in return. And Rafe knew that his journey to find a sincere heart wasn't over yet. As Brittany's presence gradually faded from his life, Natalie's image grew clearer and clearer in Rafe's mind. Day after day, through the moments when they crossed paths at the pickup station and the quiet stretches when they waited together for orders beneath the shade, he slowly came to understand more about the young woman, and every new thing he learned deepened his admiration for her. He noticed that Natalie was always the first to arrive and the last to leave. While the others were still sitting around, resting and complaining, she had already quietly accepted another order, seizing every possible delivery and racing against time as though each passing minute were infinitely precious. She worked without pause, her face always touched by a faint weariness, yet the light of determination in her eyes never once went out. Rafe grew curious about her life, and through scattered fragments of conversation and passing remarks from people in the neighborhood, he gradually understood why she had to push herself so relentlessly. Natalie wasn't living only for herself. An entire family rested upon her slender shoulders. Her mother, the woman who had once worked tirelessly to raise her, was now gravely ill and had been confined to bed for a long time, unable to manage even the simplest parts of daily life without someone's care. The monthly cost of medicine weighed upon their already difficult existence like a massive stone. Besides her mother, Natalie also had a younger brother named Danny, a boy still young enough to be in school, still growing, still carrying so many unfinished dreams before him. Their father had died many years earlier, leaving the mother and her 2 children alone and vulnerable in the vast current of life. And so Natalie, that young woman, had stepped forward and taken every burden upon herself. She became the family's provider, its source of emotional strength, a devoted daughter, and a protective older sister within their small home. Rafe understood that the deliveries she tirelessly made from morning until night weren't meant to buy anything for herself, weren't meant to pay for beauty treatments or personal pleasures, but to purchase medicine for her mother, to keep her younger brother in school, and to prevent the fragile roof over their heads from collapsing. What moved Rafe most wasn't the hardship of her circumstances, because during the past few days, he had already witnessed far too many lives marked by suffering. What truly earned his respect was the way Natalie faced the cruelty of her fate. She never complained. She never uttered a word of resentment toward life, and never recited her sorrows in the hope of gaining anyone's pity. Brittany had rushed to complain and beg for money the moment she encountered the smallest inconvenience, while Natalie carried a burden heavy enough to crush most people, and had never once held out her hand to ask anyone for a single dollar. She endured in silence, shouldered everything without a word, and still managed to offer others a warm smile whenever she met them. Once, Rafe happened to overhear someone in the neighborhood offering her a little money, but Natalie politely refused. She said that as long as she still had 2 hands and enough strength to work, she would earn what her family needed by herself, because she didn't want to become anyone's burden or owe anyone a debt. Those words left Rafe motionless. He suddenly remembered the image of Brittany turning cold the moment he refused to give her the amount she wanted, then looked toward Natalie, a woman poor in possessions yet so rich in self-respect that anyone would have been compelled to admire her. 2 women, 2 destinies, and 2 entirely opposite characters stood vividly within his mind, like the light and darkness of life itself. Rafe began to understand something that all his years of wealth had never taught him. A person's true worth wasn't measured by how much money they carried in their pocket, but by how much dignity they preserved within their heart, especially when they had nothing else left in their hands. Natalie had no wealth, no social standing, and none of the things the world so eagerly admired, but she possessed a kind heart, an unbreakable spirit, and a sense of dignity that even many of the powerful people Rafe had known might never possess. The more he learned about her, the more a strange feeling began rising inside him. Something made of admiration, deep respect, and beneath it all, a quiet ache of compassion. He wondered why someone so good had been forced to suffer so much, and why life had placed such a crushing burden upon shoulders so delicate. And without knowing when it had begun, a small desire started to awaken within the heart of the man who had once possessed everything, a heart he had believed had grown hardened by suspicion. He wanted to do something for her. He wanted to ease the burden she carried, not through the power or wealth of Raffaele Conti, but through the genuine kindness of one human being offered to another. That small desire soon found its chance to become an action on an afternoon of torrential rain. That day, a violent downpour came without warning, heavy drops striking the pavement until the entire neighborhood seemed to disappear behind a gray curtain of water. Rafe had just finished a delivery and was about to find somewhere to shelter when he caught sight of a familiar figure standing beside the road ahead. He narrowed his eyes through the rain, and his heart tightened. It was Natalie. She stood beside her delivery vehicle, completely drenched, her wet hair clinging to her pale face. Her vehicle had stalled in the middle of the road and lay motionless beneath the rain, while she desperately struggled to start it again without success. Rafe immediately pulled over and stepped into the downpour without giving a thought to the fact that he was getting soaked as well. As he approached, he realized that Natalie wasn't merely wet from the rain. Her eyes were red, and she stood frozen as though she might collapse at any moment. He asked whether she was all right, and at those words, the tears she had been holding back threatened to spill over, blending with the rainwater streaming down her cheeks. In a broken voice, she told him that the vehicle had been dead for some time, that the order inside had already missed its delivery time, and that if she arrived this late, she would certainly be fined. At that moment, even a single fine was a great deal of money to her, money she had intended to save for her mother's medicine. She stood there in the cold rain, helplessly watching the minutes pass and not knowing what to do. The sight filled Rafe with a deep ache. He was a man who had once controlled an enormous fortune, a man who could purchase an entire company with a simple gesture, yet now he stood before a young woman who was crying because she feared losing such a small amount of money. The contrast sent a sharp pain through his heart. But he didn't allow himself to remain lost in emotion. He reassured her and told her not to worry, then immediately went to work. He bent beside the broken vehicle, letting the rain pour across his back as he examined each part with surprising skill. Though he had taken on the role of a poor delivery driver, the confidence and resourcefulness of a seasoned man remained fully alive within him. Before long, he found the problem and repaired the vehicle. But he knew that even though the engine was running again, the order was already late. So he told Natalie to give the package to him and let him rush it to the customer in his own vehicle, while she took the repaired one somewhere dry before both she and the machine broke down completely in the storm. Natalie stared at him in astonishment, unable to believe what she had just heard. In a world where everyone looked after only themselves, where people competed for every delivery and every small dollar, there was a man willing to stand in the rain and repair her vehicle, then take over the delivery so she wouldn't be fined. She stammered her thanks, her voice trembling from the cold and from emotion. Rafe only smiled faintly and said it was nothing, then quickly took the package and drove away through the curtain of rain. Because of him, the order reached its destination. It was late, but it still arrived soon enough to spare her from the severe penalty. That afternoon, after the rain had stopped, they met again at the pickup station. Natalie walked toward him, and what she did left Rafe astonished once more. She held out a small amount of money and told him it was for the fuel he had used while delivering her package, insisting that she had to repay him. Rafe waved it away and said that he had helped because he truly wanted to, and that the cost of a little fuel meant nothing. But Natalie firmly pressed the money into his hand, her eyes serious and sincere. She told him that he had saved her from the penalty, and that she was deeply grateful, but she couldn't allow him to suffer a loss because of her. She said she would always remember his kindness, but anything that ought to be settled fairly must be settled fairly. She didn't want to owe anyone anything, not even the cost of a little fuel. Faced with her determination, Rafe finally accepted the money, but something inside him had begun to tremble with unexpected force. He looked at the young woman standing before him, a woman who had endured a miserable afternoon, soaked through and exhausted, yet had still preserved that precious sense of dignity. And he understood that from that moment forward, the distance between them was no longer as great as it had once been. From that rainy afternoon onward, something changed inside Rafe, and he began finding his own ways to care for Natalie, quietly and discreetly, without drawing attention to himself and without offering a single flowery word. He knew that a woman with as much dignity as Natalie would never accept help if she believed it came from pity, so he had to be more careful and more thoughtful. He noticed that whenever Natalie spoke about her mother, a shadow of sadness passed through her eyes, because the cost of her medicine remained a constant worry that never truly left her. So one day, Rafe went to a pharmacy, purchased every kind of medicine her mother needed, and brought them to Natalie, but he didn't tell her they were a gift from him. He knew she would refuse them at once if he did. Instead, he invented an excuse, telling her that the medicines were part of a promotional reward the delivery company had given to employees with strong performance that month, and that since he was a single man who had no use for any of them, it would be a shame to let them go to waste, so he had brought them for her. Natalie hesitated at first, but his explanation sounded reasonable enough, and she finally accepted them with gratitude beyond words, never realizing that the man standing before her had quietly spent his own money to care for her mother. When Rafe saw the relieved smile upon her face, an extraordinary warmth filled his heart, a feeling that all the wealth and power he had once possessed had never been able to give him. Rafe didn't only care about Natalie's mother. He also began paying attention to her young brother. The boy's name was Danny, a bright and well-behaved child who was still attending school. On some mornings, Natalie had to begin work so early that she didn't have time to take him to class, leaving the boy to walk a long distance alone while she spent the entire day worrying about him. When Rafe learned about this, he offered to take Danny to school whenever her shift kept her busy, saying that his delivery route passed that way anyway. Natalie felt deeply uncomfortable about troubling him at first, but when she saw how sincere and eager he was to help, and thought of how exhausting the long walk was for her brother, she gradually agreed. And so, on those mornings, people often saw the poor delivery driver carrying a young boy behind him, the two of them talking and laughing all along the road to school. Danny openly adored Rafe. The boy eagerly told him about everything, his lessons, his friends, and the innocent dreams he carried for the future. He proudly spoke about the high grade he had received on a test, and about his dream of growing up to accomplish something truly great, so his mother and sister would never have to suffer again. Rafe listened to every word with genuine affection, occasionally offering encouragement and reminding him to study hard. Some days, he even bought the boy a new box of pencils or a beautiful notebook, tiny gifts that were enough to make the child's eyes shine with radiant joy. Those mornings spent taking Danny to school gradually became a familiar and comforting part of Rafe's life. The man who had once been accustomed to tense meetings and cold calculations in the world of business now found simple happiness in a little boy's laughter and in the morning sunlight falling across the road to school. He began to understand that happiness could sometimes be as simple as this, and that these ordinary moments were more precious than every lavish celebration he had ever attended. As for Natalie, she could clearly feel how much her family's life had changed since Rafe had entered it. Her mother had a fuller supply of medicine, and her health visibly improved. Her younger brother was taken to and from school and had gained another brother, another friend with whom he could share his thoughts. Natalie herself, through the exhausting struggle of earning a living, now had a quiet companion who was always ready to offer his hand whenever she needed it. She never spoke of it aloud, but within her heart, the image of that man grew larger with every passing day. She cherished him not because he gave her money, for she believed he was just as poor as she was, but because he gave her something far more precious, sincere concern and kindness without expectation. And so, between those two people who believed themselves equally poor, a beautiful feeling quietly began to grow. It needed no polished declarations and no expensive gifts. It simply deepened day by day through gentle acts of care and deeds that came directly from the heart. One evening, after both of them had finished another endlessly long shift, Rafe invited Natalie to stop at a small roadside eatery for something warm to eat. It was nothing more than a modest sidewalk stall with a few old plastic tables, but for two poor working people, a hot meal after an exhausting day was already something precious. They sat across from each other over simple plates of food, while the streetlight cast a soft, yellow glow upon their table. Perhaps it was because of that rare moment of peace, or perhaps because she had begun to trust the man sitting before her. But that evening, Natalie opened her heart more than she usually did. She began telling him about her family, about the years that had passed, and especially about the father she had lost many years earlier. Her voice grew quieter, touched by a distant sadness whenever she spoke of him. She said her father's name was Thomas, and that he had been an unusually gentle and honorable man. In the past, her family hadn't been nearly as poor as they were now. Her father had once worked as a bookkeeper for a large business, a position that demanded great attention to detail and, above all else, absolute honesty. And her father had been the very embodiment of that honesty. He had always taught his children that a person must live with integrity, that whether money was little or plentiful, it had to be earned cleanly, and that it was better to remain poor with a clear conscience than to become wealthy through deceit. Natalie said she had always been proud of her father and of the kind of man he was, but then her voice caught in her throat. She explained that one day, her father had suddenly died in an accident, leaving this world without even the chance to speak a final word. His death had come without warning and had dealt her family a devastating blow, yet what followed was even more painful. After he died, her family wasn't allowed even a moment of peace. Instead, an unexpected debt suddenly fell upon them, a debt whose origins Natalie still didn't fully understand even now. That debt had dragged her family from a life where they had enough food and clothing into one of crushing poverty. Her mother, already a fragile woman, couldn't endure the shock of losing her husband along with the mounting burden that followed. She collapsed in both spirit and body, then became bedridden, and remained that way to this day. From that moment onward, every responsibility fell upon Natalie's shoulders, though she had still been little more than a young girl herself. She had been forced to wipe away her tears, set aside her youth and all the dreams she had once carried, and struggle to earn a living for her mother and younger brother. As Rafe listened, he fell completely silent. He could feel the pain woven into every word she spoke, and his heart tightened with compassion. He gently asked more about her father, and Natalie, her eyes filled with tenderness, reached into her old wallet and took out a photograph faded by the passing years. She said it was one of the few pictures of her father that remained, and that she carried it with her at all times as though it were a treasure. With great care, she handed the photograph to Rafe. He accepted it, and the moment his eyes settled upon the man's face, a strange sensation suddenly rose inside him. That face, those eyes, seemed to awaken something impossibly familiar within him. He felt as though he had seen this man somewhere before, somewhere buried far in the distance of his memory, somewhere connected to the old world of Raffaele Conti. His heart seemed to miss a beat, but it was only a vague instinct that passed through him, fragile as smoke and impossible to grasp. He couldn't remember exactly where he had seen that face, nor could he be certain whether the feeling of recognition was real or merely a trick of his imagination. Rafe studied the photograph for a long time, searching through his memory, but everything remained blurred and uncertain. He said nothing about the strange feeling. He simply looked quietly at the gentle face of the man who had passed away, then softly remarked that Thomas looked kind and good-hearted. Natalie gave him a sorrowful smile, took back the photograph, and returned it to her wallet as though she were protecting the most sacred part of her life. Rafe remained calm on the outside, but within him, that faint sense of recognition continued to linger. He told himself that perhaps he was thinking too much, and that it might have been nothing more than a coincidence. Yet deep within his mind, a small question had already begun to form, a question he couldn't yet give a name. He had no idea that the fleeting feeling of familiarity he experienced during that quiet evening was the first delicate thread leading toward a secret that had been buried for years, a secret powerful enough to shake everything he believed to its foundation. Pushing that vague premonition aside, Rafe returned to the warmth of that evening. Their modest meal was slowly coming to an end, yet neither of them wanted to rise from the table, as though they were both trying to hold on a little longer to those rare and peaceful moments together. Their conversation turned toward gentler things, and after releasing some of the sorrow she had carried inside for so long, Natalie's face gradually softened and became more serene. She looked at Rafe with tenderness, then, in a sincere voice, spoke the words she had perhaps been keeping in her heart for a long time. She told him how grateful she was to have met him during these difficult days. She said that in a world where people cared only for themselves, among those who were willing to trample over one another for the smallest advantage, someone as kind and warm as he was truly rare. Then she looked directly into his eyes and said something that made Rafe's heart tremble with powerful emotion. She told him that he was a good man, a man with a beautiful heart, and that he mustn't ever look down on himself or believe he was inferior or unworthy simply because he was poor. She said poverty couldn't define a person's value, that she had met many wealthy people who were mean-spirited and had also seen people with nothing who carried themselves with true nobility, and that in her eyes, he was noble in exactly that way. Those simple words, spoken by the poor young woman sitting across from him, reached the deepest place within Rafe's soul. He sat in silence, feeling a wave of warmth and emotion rise inside his chest. All his life, from the moment he was born, he had lived surrounded by luxury, encircled by countless people, and praised with countless flattering words. But every one of those praises had been meant for Rafe Conti, for his power, his wealth, and his position. Not once had anyone loved or valued him simply for the man he was when he had nothing in his hands. Yet now, when he appeared to be nothing more than a penniless delivery driver, there was a woman looking at him with such sincerity and speaking to him with such warmth. She didn't know who he truly was. She knew nothing about his immense fortune or the power he commanded. She cared for him simply because he was himself, because of his heart and the way he treated her and her family. This was exactly what Rafe had searched for throughout all those years. It was the answer to the question that had haunted him through so many sleepless nights. His heart, the heart he had believed had turned to stone beneath years of suspicion and loneliness, was now beating wildly once again. He looked at Natalie, and in that moment, he knew that what he felt for her had grown far beyond ordinary admiration or respect. He had truly fallen for her. He had truly come to love this woman. Something stirred urgently within him, a longing to confess everything and tell her about all the emotions surging through his heart. He drew in a quiet breath, his lips parting as though he were about to speak the words he had never said to any woman in his life. The moment was so close, close enough that with only one more sentence, every hidden feeling would have been laid bare. But at that fateful instant, the phone in his pocket suddenly began to ring, cutting through everything. Rafe froze. He looked down at the screen, and the color briefly changed in his face. The call was from the family, from the old world he had temporarily left behind. A call at this hour, made with such urgency, couldn't possibly concern anything trivial. The warmth in his heart suddenly faded. He looked at Natalie, then at the phone that continued ringing, and an ominous feeling rose within him. The confession that had nearly escaped his lips caught in his throat and was swallowed back into silence. He apologized to her, stood, and walked to a quiet corner to answer the call, unaware that it would pull him back into the obligations of his former world and place his newly blossoming love before its first cruel trial. The call that night was from Luigi, and his voice sounded more serious than ever. He told Rafe that Uncle Giovanni, the head of the Conti family, needed to see him immediately, that something of great importance had happened and couldn't be delayed any longer. Rafe understood that no matter how much he wanted to avoid it, he couldn't turn his back on the family forever. The following morning, he temporarily set aside the life of Rafe Marino and returned to the magnificent mansion he had abandoned for so long. The moment he stepped inside, Uncle Giovanni was already waiting for him, his expression troubled and stern. He reprimanded Rafe for disappearing for such a long time without a single explanation, and leaving the entire family deeply concerned. Then he went straight to the matter that had forced him to summon Rafe home so urgently. He said the Conti family now stood before a rare opportunity to strengthen its power and expand its influence. and that opportunity lay in an alliance with the Ashford family, one of the most powerful families the Countess had long regarded with caution. According to Giovanni, the best way to bind the two sides together was through marriage, and he had already chosen a bride for Rafe, Camille Ashford, the cherished daughter of that family. At those words, Rafe went completely still. He hadn't imagined that the call bringing him home would lead to something like this. Struggling to keep his voice calm, he said that he had no feelings for the woman, and that he didn't want to enter a marriage built solely upon calculated interests. But Uncle Giovanni dismissed his objection at once. He said this wasn't a matter of personal affection, but a matter concerning the future of the entire family, a responsibility Rafe was required to bear as its heir. He reminded him that the Conti family had survived for generations because its leaders had always placed the greater good above everything else, and now it was Rafe's turn to do the same. While the tension between them continued to rise, Camille Ashford appeared. She entered with an air of refined arrogance, dressed in dazzling clothes, her face beautiful but touched by a cold and haughty expression. From the very first glance, Rafe felt the immeasurable distance between this woman and Natalie. Camille greeted him with a courteous smile, then began speaking endlessly about lavish plans, social standing, and the powerful connections of her family. She spoke of the arranged marriage as though it were nothing more than a business transaction, a union between two empires that would create an even greater force. Unlike Natalie, Camille knew exactly who Rafe was. She knew he was the powerful boss who stood at the head of the Conti family, and she knew the full extent of his immense fortune and influence. Because of that, the way she looked at him glittered with an ambition she made no effort to conceal. As the conversation continued, Camille carelessly revealed her true nature. Whenever she spoke of poor workers or ordinary people, her voice was filled with contempt. She said that people born into poverty belonged at the bottom of society and weren't worthy of the attention of those from the upper class, people like her and Rafe. She made cruel remarks about those she considered beneath her, and for a moment, her beautiful face became frighteningly cold. Every word she spoke cut into Rafe's heart like a blade. He knew that the people Camille was despising were Natalie, her mother, young Danny, and the countless honest people he had met over the past several days, people who might have been poor in material possessions but who possessed far greater dignity and character than Camille ever could. Rafe stood there in the middle of his own magnificent mansion, his heart torn in countless directions. On one side stood his duty to the family, the responsibility of being its heir, and the pressure of an uncle he had always deeply respected. On the other stood the love that had only just begun to blossom between him and Natalie, the woman who had allowed him to experience the sincere affection he had longed for all his life. He knew exactly whom his heart belonged to, and he knew he could never force himself to marry someone like Camille. But he also understood that defying the will of the family wouldn't be simple, especially once Uncle Giovanni had made his decision. And so, in that moment, instead of refusing outright, Rafe chose silence. He didn't agree, but he didn't yet dare to reject the proposal completely. Hesitation began to take root inside him, born from obligations he didn't yet know how to escape. He had no idea that his silence and uncertainty, though they came from an impossible situation, were about to inflict a deep wound upon the woman he loved most. From the day Rafe was drawn back into the turmoil of the family, he could no longer hold on to the peace he had once known. His meetings with Natalie became less frequent, and even when he was beside her, his mind was often lost beneath the weight of heavy thoughts. The pressure of the arranged marriage, the struggle between duty and love, all of it made him quieter and more distant. He no longer laughed and spoke as freely as he had in the beginning. His eyes were often clouded with worry, and at times he unintentionally missed their plans without being able to explain the reason. Natalie, with the sensitivity of a woman who had begun to care deeply, naturally felt the change in him. She realized that the man who had once been so gentle and warm toward her now seemed to be building an invisible wall between them. She saw how he avoided her gaze, how he often fell into silence beneath burdens he refused to share. At first, she thought perhaps he was facing some difficulty at work, but little by little, darker thoughts began to creep into her mind. She wondered whether she had done something wrong, whether she had opened her heart too quickly, whether she had hoped for too much from something so fragile. Then, because she was always thinking of others and carried a quiet shame about her own poverty, Natalie slowly reached a conclusion that pierced her heart. She began to believe that perhaps she wasn't worthy of him. She thought of herself as nothing more than a poor delivery woman carrying an entire family upon her shoulders, with a bedridden mother and a young brother depending on her, and that being with her could only bring another burden into his life. Perhaps he had finally realized that and was trying to walk away. The more she thought about it, the more deeply wounded she became. But instead of blaming him or trying to hold him back, Natalie chose to quietly retreat. She told herself that she didn't want to become a burden in his life and didn't want to hold back a man she cherished. If being beside her caused him worry, then perhaps it was better for her to let go first so he could be free. And so she began avoiding him, claiming she was too busy to meet, withdrawing behind the walls of her own dignity and insecurity. Rafe, meanwhile, clearly felt Natalie pulling away, and it cut through his heart like a blade. He knew she had misunderstood him, knew she was tormenting herself with thoughts that weren't true. He wanted to run to her, to explain everything, to tell her that he had become distant not because she was unworthy, but because of the cruel obligations tied to the true identity he was still hiding. Yet he still couldn't speak. He didn't know where to begin, didn't know how to face the truth of who he really was, and he feared that once the truth came into the light, everything between them would collapse. So he carried the pain in silence and allowed the distance between them to grow wider with each passing day. During those troubled days, the vague feeling from the evening at the roadside food stall returned to Rafe's mind, stronger than ever before. The face of Natalie's late father in that faded photograph continued to haunt him, and that sense of familiarity felt like a quiet voice urging him to uncover the truth. He couldn't explain why he felt that way, but the instinct of a man who had survived a lifetime of hidden motives warned him that something far from simple lay behind it. And so, during the lonely nights inside the mansion, Rafe began searching in secret. He reopened the family's old archives, turned through files covered in years of dust, and examined faded photographs of the many people who had served or stood beside the Conti family across generations. He was searching for a face, the face of the man named Thomas in Natalie's photograph. Night after night, he continued turning page after page, but still couldn't find any clear trace. The less he found, the more uneasy he became, and an unnameable dread continued to grow inside him. He sensed that he was standing at the threshold of a secret buried long ago, a secret that, once revealed, might change everything, both his own life and the life of the woman he loved. Rafe's persistence was finally rewarded, but in a way that left him more shaken than anything else ever had. Late one night, as he searched through an old file buried deep inside the family archives, his eyes suddenly stopped upon a photograph yellowed by the passing years. The image showed a group of people connected to the Conti family many years earlier, and among all those unfamiliar faces was one that seemed to make his heart stop. It was the very same face he had seen in the photograph Natalie had shown him, the gentle face of her late father, Thomas. It was no longer a vague feeling or an uncertain instinct. The truth now stood clearly before him. Natalie's father had once been part of the Conti family. The discovery left Rafe stunned. He held the photograph in his hands, his heart pounding as countless questions surged through his mind. Why had Natalie's father once been connected to his family, and why had he died so suddenly, leaving his wife and children to fall into such terrible hardship? Unable to wait any longer, Rafe took the photograph to Uncle Giovanni the following morning. He placed it on the table before him and demanded to know about the man named Thomas, who he had been, and what had truly happened to him all those years ago. The moment Giovanni saw the photograph, the color drained from his face. His usual commanding expression softened, replaced by a distant sorrow and a deep regret that had been buried for far too long. He released a heavy sigh, then slowly began telling Rafe a story from many years earlier, a story he had never shared with anyone. He said that Thomas Brennan had once kept the financial records for the Conti family, and that he had trusted and respected Thomas more than almost anyone. Thomas hadn't only been remarkably capable, but honest in a way that was exceedingly rare. He had always kept every number transparent, and had remained upright in a world filled with deception and hidden motives. It was because of that honesty and skill that Thomas had once saved Giovanni from a vicious financial scheme, an elaborate trap that had nearly cost him his entire fortune and reputation. Had Thomas not discovered the plot in time and exposed it, the Conti family might have collapsed long ago. Because of that, Giovanni had never regarded Thomas as merely a man who worked beneath him. Thomas had been his benefactor, a man to whom he owed a debt for the rest of his life. But then tragedy struck. Giovanni continued, his voice tightening with emotion. Through the sharp instincts of a man who understood every detail hidden within the books, Thomas had discovered that a traitor was operating inside the family, a trusted associate whom many people relied upon, secretly stealing and betraying the Contis by draining their assets for his own benefit. Thomas, whose integrity wouldn't allow him to ignore wrongdoing, decided to gather evidence and bring the traitor into the light. He believed justice would prevail and that the truth had to be revealed, but he hadn't anticipated the cruelty of the man he intended to expose. Before Thomas could make everything public, he suddenly died in an accident. It was an accident that Giovanni still believed hadn't been nearly as simple as it had been made to appear. He had always suspected that the traitor had arranged Thomas's death, silencing him before the secret could be uncovered. But at the time, every piece of evidence had disappeared with Thomas, leaving Giovanni with nothing except the grief of losing a man he deeply respected. What tormented him most, Giovanni said, was that after Thomas's death, he hadn't been able to protect the family of the man who had saved him. The Brennan family was suddenly struck by disaster, then quietly vanished and moved away without leaving any trace of where they had gone. Giovanni had sent people to search for them for years, hoping to repay part of the debt he owed, hoping to make amends for having failed to protect them. But their trail seemed to vanish from the face of the earth, and in the end, he was left powerless, carrying that regret within him for all those years. By the time Giovanni finished, Rafe stood completely motionless, his entire body seemingly turned to stone. Every scattered piece that had troubled him for so long suddenly fell into place with perfect and merciless clarity. The woman he had come to love, the woman who had given him the most sincere affection he had ever known, was the daughter of Thomas Brennan, the man who had saved the entire Conti family. Natalie's tragic fate, the unjust debt that had dragged her family into ruin, the mysterious death of her father, all of it had begun with a dark secret buried for years within Rafe's own family. His heart twisted with pain, compassion, and a shock too deep to describe. He realized that perhaps his meeting with Natalie had never been an accident at all, but a thread of destiny binding their two families together through the past. And he understood that the time had come for him to act, not only for the sake of the woman he loved, but also to restore justice to the man who could no longer speak for himself. While Rafe was still struggling to recover from the shock, he pressed Uncle Giovanni with one more question, a question he couldn't leave unasked. Who was the traitor from all those years ago, the man responsible for Thomas's death and for plunging his family into a life of suffering, and where was he now? Uncle Giovanni remained silent for a long time, a bitter and pained expression passing across his face. Then he spoke a name that made Rafe's entire body jolt, a name he never could have imagined. The traitor wasn't some distant stranger. It was Ashford himself, Camille's father, the very man whose family the Contis now hoped to join through the arranged marriage. Giovanni explained that years earlier, Ashford had been the trusted associate in whom the entire family placed its faith. The man Thomas discovered had been secretly stealing from and betraying the Contis. After Thomas's death, every piece of evidence disappeared. Ashford not only escaped punishment, but continued rising in power, gradually building his own fortune and influence, until he eventually became the head of a family powerful enough to stand as an equal to the Contis. As Rafe listened, a chill ran through him while the dark design slowly revealed itself before his eyes. He realized that the proposed marriage alliance between the two families wasn't nearly as simple as it appeared. Behind it lay a ruthless move Ashford had been planning for a very long time. The traitor from the past, having now built power of his own, intended to use this marriage to work his way deeper into the Conti family and gradually seize the authority and wealth that generations of Contis had spent their lives building. In Ashford's eyes, the marriage between Rafe and Camille was nothing more than a bridge that would allow him to complete the scheme he had left unfinished years before and swallow the entire legacy of the family he had once betrayed. The only thing that brought Rafe even the slightest relief amid those terrible revelations was his understanding of Camille. Though she was arrogant and contemptuous of others, from Giovanni's account and from everything Rafe himself had observed, he believed Camille knew absolutely nothing about her father's crimes in the past. She was merely a piece in Ashford's game, a daughter raised in luxury who had no idea that her family's wealth had been built upon the blood and tears of others. She had grown up taking pride in her family name, never suspecting that behind its shining glory lay a secret of monstrous guilt. Now that Rafe knew the truth, he understood that he needed evidence to expose Ashford, restore Thomas's good name, and bring justice to Natalie's family. But the evidence from years ago had vanished long ago, so where could he possibly begin? As though he had read the question in Rafe's mind, Uncle Giovanni suddenly remembered something. He told Rafe that Thomas had possessed a particular habit. He had been a careful and meticulous man, and besides maintaining the family's official financial records, he had also kept a private notebook, written entirely in his own hand, which he always stored at home. completely separate from the family's business documents. In that notebook, Thomas often recorded the things he observed, the suspicions that troubled him, and any numbers that appeared unusual. Giovanni believed that if Thomas had uncovered Ashford's crimes, there was a strong possibility he had written every piece of evidence into that private notebook, and because it had been carefully hidden at home, far removed from anything kept at the company, the traitor might never have known it existed. If that notebook had survived, it would be the only remaining evidence powerful enough to expose the entire conspiracy from all those years ago. Uncle Giovanni's words flashed through Rafe's mind like a sudden ray of light. He stood in silence, thinking deeply, until an idea appeared that made his heart begin to pound. He remembered Natalie, the way she treasured her father's old photograph as though it were something sacred, and how her family had preserved his belongings through all their years of hardship. Rafe suddenly realized that the notebook Giovanni had described, the precious evidence that could change everything, might still be hidden somewhere among the possessions Natalie's mother had kept. Perhaps her family had carried it with them all these years as a cherished reminder of the man they had lost, never knowing that within those yellowed pages lay a shattering truth, a truth capable of clearing their late father's name and bringing down a traitor who had hidden behind the mask of wealth and respectability for far too long. With that newly kindled hope, Rafe quietly returned to the poor neighborhood to visit Natalie's mother. He continued presenting himself as nothing more than an acquaintance, a kind friend of her daughter, and didn't reveal his true purpose. Sitting beside the sick woman's bed, he gently guided the conversation toward her late husband and the keepsakes she had preserved. Touched by the sincere concern of the young man her daughter cared for, the mother slowly began telling him about Thomas, then asked him to retrieve an old box she had carefully hidden in the corner of the closet, where she kept everything that remained of the husband she had loved so dearly. When Rafe opened the box, his heart began pounding. Inside were several worn belongings, old letters, faded photographs, and lying silently at the very bottom was a small notebook whose cover had become frayed and yellowed with time. He lifted it with trembling hands, and the moment he began turning through its pages, he knew he had found exactly what he needed. It was Thomas's private notebook, the place where he had meticulously recorded every irregular number and every piece of evidence concerning Ashford's embezzlement and betrayal all those years ago. For all this time, Natalie's family had preserved it as a cherished keepsake, never realizing that within those aging pages lay a truth powerful enough to shake an entire family to its foundation. Rafe asked permission to borrow the notebook, explaining that he wanted to preserve her late husband's keepsake more carefully, and the gentle mother trusted him enough to place it in his hands without the slightest suspicion. With the evidence finally in his possession, Rafe returned to the mansion and summoned a gathering of the entire family. He invited Uncle Giovanni, the elders of the Conti family, and the Ashford family as well, under the pretense of discussing the approaching marriage alliance. Ashford arrived with a triumphant expression, believing that his long game was about to reach its final move and that he would soon seize the entire Conti legacy. Camille was also present, as elegant and cold as ever, but the atmosphere in the room suddenly changed when Rafe rose to his feet. He was no longer a poor delivery driver, nor was he hiding behind hesitation. He had returned with the full presence and authority of the man who stood at the head of the Conti family. His eyes were sharp and cold, and his deep voice carried undeniable weight. Before everyone gathered there, he placed Thomas's old notebook upon the table and began exposing every crime Ashford had committed in the past. He read aloud the numbers, the written observations, and the undeniable evidence of the embezzlement and betrayal Ashford had concealed for so many years. The entire room fell into stunned silence before erupting in disbelief. Ashford's face turned deathly pale. He struggled desperately to deny everything, raising his voice and accusing Rafe of presenting forged evidence. But confronted with the unmistakable handwriting of the very man he had once destroyed, and with the severe gazes of Uncle Giovanni and the family elders fixed upon him, every excuse he offered became meaningless. Rafe then calmly exposed the plan Ashford had hidden behind the arranged marriage, his intention to seize control of the Conti family from within. The truth drove the Conti elders into a fury, while Uncle Giovanni stood motionless, his eyes filling with tears as justice was finally restored to the man who had once saved him. Without resorting to a single act of violence, using only evidence, unwavering words, and the power of his authority, Rafe destroyed Ashford's reputation, and standing before everyone in the room, the alliance between the two families collapsed immediately, and the traitor who had hidden behind wealth and respectability for so long was stripped of his mask and forced to face the contempt of everyone present. In the midst of that storm, Camille sat frozen in her chair. She stared at her father in disbelief, unable to accept that the man she had always respected, the man who had given her a life of luxury, was actually a ruthless traitor who had caused so much suffering to others. All the pride she had placed in her family name shattered in a single moment. More painfully still, everything unfolding before her made her understand that Rafe had never held any affection for her, and that the marriage she had imagined as a perfect union had been nothing more than a calculated move for power. Unable to preserve her usual air of elegance, Camille rose from her chair, her face drained of color, then quietly left the room beneath the crushing weight of humiliation and shame. She departed carrying the collapse of an entire family and the ruin of her own illusions, leaving behind a bitter truth she would have to bear for the rest of her life. After justice had been served and the traitor had been exposed, Rafe knew there was still one more important thing he had to do, something he could no longer avoid. He had to find Natalie and tell her the whole truth, both about his real identity and about her late father. That afternoon, he went to the small house where she lived, his heart crowded with conflicting emotions. When Natalie opened the door and saw him, a trace of confusion passed through her eyes, because she had been trying to avoid him for some time, but Rafe gently asked her to give him one chance to say everything he needed to say, just this once. Seeing the unfamiliar seriousness on his face, Natalie silently nodded and invited him inside. Rafe drew in a deep breath, then began removing the disguise he had worn for so many days. He told her that he wasn't Rafe Marino, the poor delivery driver she had always believed him to be. He confessed that his real name was Raffaele Conti, the head of one of the most powerful families in the city, a wealthy man whom the entire city regarded with fear and respect. He told her about the loneliness he had endured amid luxury, about the suspicion that had grown inside him while he was surrounded by people interested only in his money and power, and about his decision to pretend to be poor in order to search for genuine love, for someone who would care for him when he had nothing in his hands. Natalie was stunned. Her entire body seemed to turn to stone. She couldn't believe that the simple man she had fallen in love with, the man who had stood in the rain repairing her vehicle and driven her younger brother to school, was actually such a powerful boss. A deep sense of hurt rose inside her. She felt deceived, wounded by the knowledge that the man she had trusted most had hidden such an enormous secret from her for so long. But Rafe hadn't finished. He knew there was another truth she needed to hear, one even more important than his identity. In a gentle voice filled with emotion, he told her everything he had discovered about her late father. He explained that her father, Thomas, had once been an honest and highly respected bookkeeper for the Conti family, and that he had been so upright that he had dared to stand against a traitor and expose him in defense of what was right. He told her that her father's death hadn't been a simple accident, but that Thomas had been the victim of a dark conspiracy and had lost his life because of his integrity. Most importantly, he told her that the terrible debt that had condemned her family to years of hardship, the thing she had always believed to be a source of shame, hadn't been her father's fault at all. Her father hadn't left behind any disgraceful debt. He had been an innocent man, a quiet hero who sacrificed himself for justice, and now, after so many years of being buried beneath false accusations, his honor had finally been restored. When Natalie heard those words, she couldn't hold herself together any longer. All the emotions she had suppressed for so many years burst free in tears that streamed down her cheeks. They were tears carrying countless feelings at once. She cried because she was hurt that the truth had been hidden from her, and she cried from the shock of the terrible secrets that had just been revealed. But above all, she cried because she was overwhelmed beyond words that the honor of the father she had always loved and admired had finally been returned to him. For so many years, she had lived beneath the shame of the debt her family had been forced to bear, and she had asked herself countless times why fate had treated them with such cruelty. Only now did she understand that her father had done nothing wrong, that he had died unjustly simply because he had chosen to live with integrity. The agony of learning that her father had been the victim of a ruthless conspiracy mingled with the comfort of knowing that he had remained an innocent man, and all of it surged through the young woman's heart. Natalie sat there crying as she struggled to absorb the overwhelming truths that had suddenly fallen upon her. She looked at Rafe, her eyes carrying both anger, because he had concealed so much from her, and profound gratitude because he was the one who had endured every difficulty to uncover the truth, restore her father's good name, and bring justice to her entire family. In that moment, amid her tears and all the tangled emotions within her, her heart began a silent struggle between the pain of betrayal and the love she still carried for the man standing before her. Rafe understood that the wounds in Natalie's heart couldn't be soothed by only a few words. Once trust had been shaken, it needed time and sincerity before it could be restored, so he didn't rush her, didn't pressure her to forgive him or accept his love immediately. Instead, he chose to prove the truth of his heart through concrete actions, day after day, just as he had once quietly cared for her and her family before. He made sure her mother received all the medicine she needed and brought skilled doctors directly to their home, allowing the illness that had tormented her for so long to gradually ease. He no longer had to hide behind awkward excuses as he had before, but did everything openly and sincerely, not as a powerful boss bestowing favors, but as a son who wished to repay a debt of gratitude and care for the family of the woman he loved. With young Danny, Rafe remained just as warm and close as he had always been. He still came often to take the boy to and from school, still listened to his childhood stories, and still encouraged him to study hard. Danny had adored him for a long time, and now he clung to him even more. The boy's bright laughter whenever Rafe was near filled the small house with warmth and helped lift some of the heaviness that had settled over the family after everything they had endured. As Natalie watched Rafe care tenderly for her younger brother and look after her mother, her heart slowly began to soften. She realized that whether he was a powerful boss or a poor delivery driver, the heart he offered her family remained exactly the same, sincere and warm. Then one day, Uncle Giovanni personally came to the Brennan family's small home. He was the commanding head of the powerful Conti family. Yet when he stepped inside that humble house, he carried himself with humility and deep emotion. He had come to apologize and to repay, in some small measure, the debt of gratitude that had weighed upon his heart for so many years. When he sat beside Natalie's mother's sickbed, the two people who had endured so much looked at one another, and in that moment, memories of the past came rushing back. With trembling hands, Giovanni took out Thomas's old notebook, the keepsake that had finally cleared the name of the man who had once saved him. When Natalie's mother saw her late husband's familiar handwriting and recognized the sacred family possession, she broke down in uncontrollable tears. Giovanni's voice also tightened with emotion as he spoke of the past and apologized for having failed to protect Thomas's family. Two people once connected through a history filled with pain now recognized each other again, weeping together for the man they had lost and beginning to mend the wounds left behind by time and injustice. It was a deeply moving moment that brought tears to the eyes of everyone who witnessed it, as an old debt of gratitude was finally repaid and years of injustice were at last put to rest. After witnessing all of this, Natalie understood that the affection Rafe and the entire Conti family held for her family was genuine, and that he hadn't done any of it merely to ease his guilt, but with all the sincerity in his heart. One evening, she went to see him. Her eyes no longer held the anger or distance they once had, but instead carried gentleness mixed with quiet seriousness. She told him that she had forgiven him for hiding his true identity, because she understood that he had his own reasons, and more than anything, everything he had done for her family had already spoken for him. But then she looked directly into his eyes and told him that her forgiveness came with one condition. She said she needed him to show her through actions, not words, that he would always stand beside her and remain with her no matter what happened. She had suffered too much pain and loss in her life to give her trust completely and easily. She needed a sincere promise from the depths of his heart. Rafe looked at her with unmistakable honesty and determination. He took her calloused hands in his and promised that from that moment forward, he would never allow anyone to look down on her or hurt her again. He promised to remain a steady source of strength for both her and her family, and to spend the rest of his life making up for all the suffering and unfairness she had been forced to endure. That promise, simple yet unshakable, became a thread drawing their two hearts closer together and opened a new beginning for them after all the storms they had survived. After all the storms they had endured, Rafe and Natalie began a new chapter in their lives, one filled with warmth and meaning. Rafe never forgot the days when he had worn that old delivery uniform. He never forgot the sweat, the insults, the exhausting trips beneath the burning sun and pouring rain, or the feeling of being treated as though he were invisible amid the endless current of life. Those experiences taught him the greatest lesson of his life, that behind every ordinary working person was an entire destiny, a story, and a sense of dignity worthy of respect. To honor the man who had passed away and to offer help to the struggling people he had encountered, Rafe decided to establish a charitable foundation named after Thomas Brennan, Natalie's late father, the honest man who had lost his life for doing what was right. The foundation was created to support poor delivery workers, exhausted manual laborers, and single mothers who struggled every day to earn a living. No one was more deserving than Natalie to lead that foundation. More than anyone else. She understood the hardships those people faced. She had once been one of them, and had tasted every bitterness they were still enduring. Under her leadership, the foundation helped countless families escape desperate circumstances, bringing smiles and hope to lives that seemed to have been forgotten. Rafe didn't stop there. He also changed the way his entire family treated those who worked for them. He demanded that everyone in the Conti family respect servants and laborers without judging them by wealth or social standing, because he had come to understand that a person's worth wasn't measured by status or money, but by the goodness and character within their heart. Under the guidance of a leader who had been shaped by the days he spent living as a poor man, an entire powerful family gradually changed, becoming more compassionate and humane. Then, on a beautiful day, Rafe decided to ask Natalie to marry him. He didn't propose with lavish ceremonies or expensive jewelry, but with the simplest and most sincere expression of his heart. He took her hand, looked deeply into her eyes, and asked whether she would walk beside him for the rest of their lives. With tears of happiness shimmering in her eyes, Natalie nodded and said yes. Their wedding took place not long afterward. It was a small wedding, without extravagant displays meant to impress the world, but it was warm and sincere, attended only by the people they loved most. On that important day, Natalie's mother, whose health had greatly improved through careful treatment, was able to sit upright and smile as she watched her daughter put on her wedding dress, her eyes glistening with tears of long-awaited happiness. Young Danny now had a bright future before him and the opportunity to receive a proper education. He ran excitedly around the celebration, filling his sister's wedding day with cheerful laughter. The small family that had endured so much pain and loss was finally reunited in love and hope. During the wedding, Rafe led Natalie behind the house to where he had kept something special. It was the same old delivery vehicle he had driven during the days when he pretended to be poor. Its paint was still peeling away in patches, and it remained just as battered as before, yet he had carefully preserved it as though it were a priceless treasure. Natalie asked in surprise why he had kept it, and Rafe smiled before softly telling her that he had saved it because this old vehicle had led him to her. Had he not left behind his life of luxury, put on that delivery uniform, and driven this battered vehicle into the working world, he might never have met her or found the genuine love he had searched for all his life. To him, that old vehicle was the witness to a journey that had transformed his entire existence, a journey that led a man who had been lonely amid power back to the true values of life. The story of Rafe and Natalie came to a warm conclusion, leaving us with profound lessons about life. True love is never measured by wealth or social standing, but by sincerity, kindness, and the respect two people offer one another. The person who truly loves us is the one who remains beside us and treats us gently, even when we have nothing in our hands. Honesty and integrity, no matter how long they may be buried beneath injustice, will ultimately receive the justice they deserve. And a person's true value isn't found in what they wear or possess, but deep within their heart. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share this video with as many people as possible, so these beautiful values can continue spreading through the world. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you can listen to more captivating and meaningful stories every day. How did you feel about the story of Rafe and Natalie? Which part stayed with you most deeply? And what lesson did you take from it for your own life? Please leave a comment below and share the feelings that came from the depths of your heart. We always long to hear your honest emotions and thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until its final moment. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health and a life filled with happiness, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next videos.